very warm welcome to this special Folio Society event on the subject that we've all been talking about. We weren't actually talking about it at the point at which David's book was published in 2013, if one is to go by the blurb on the cover flap.
You mean you believe blurb?
Do I believe the blurb? The blurb on David Reynolds' very fine book, The Long Shadow, The Great War in the 20th Century, says, in Britain we have lost touch with the Great War. And I think we might, it's interesting to see how you feel things have changed with all this sort of festive commemoration we've had this year. But a lot of the points that he makes were absolutely fascinating to me about the way that the First World War has been reinvented in the popular imagination, not only sort of immediately after itself, then between the wars, then after the Second World War, and it's now, of course, we're in another period of reinvention. Helen Dunmore is a novelist I'm sure you all know, has written about lots of wars, but in fact your very first novel was about the First World War, wasn't it?
It was, yes. It was based on D.H. Lawrence's experiences in Cornwall in 1917.
And this most recent novel, The Lie, is actually set, it looks back into the war, but it's set just afterwards in 1920, and deals with some of the issues that David raises in his book about how the myths grew up very suddenly and grew up not entirely in an expected way. But Helen's going to start with some near contemporary evocations or responses.
Yes, I'm going to read a short poem, which some of you may know, called Achilles in the Trenches. And the reason I'm going to read it is because it's very interesting to me to look at what had furnished the minds of the young men who went to war, what was in their mind. Now, this man, Patrick Shaw Stewart, he's a very privileged young man. He's gone to Eton, he's gone to Balliol, he's the most brilliant classical scholar of his generation. And he ends up leading the firing party over the grave of Rupert Brooke. And this poem, it's his only poem that we really know, and he wrote it in 1915. It's saturated with his classical knowledge and with his attempts to relate the war he's in now to the Iliad and to create a synthesis and to put everything together again. And then after that, I'm going to read a fragment of another very different poem, post-war poem. I saw a man this morning who did not wish to die. I ask and cannot answer, if otherwise wish I. Fair broke the day this morning against the Dardanelles. The breeze blew soft, the morn's cheeks were cold as cold seashells. But other shells are waiting across the Aegean Sea, shrapnel and high explosive, shells and hells for me. Oh, hell of ships and cities, hell of men like me, fatal second Helen, why must I follow thee? Achilles came to Troyland and I to Chersonese. He turned from wrath to battle and I to 3 days' peace. Was it so hard, Achilles, so very hard to die? Thou knewest, and I know not, so much the happier I. I will go back this morning from Imbros over the sea. Stand in the trench, Achilles, flame-capped, and shout for me. Now, Patrick Shaw Stewart found out how hard it was to die in 1917 in France and was one of a whole generation of young men scythed down who at first thought, it is the luckiest thing and the most romantic. Think of fighting in the Chersonese. Or alternatively, if it's the Asiatic side they want us on the plains of Troy itself. And this is just a fragment from 1921 to 22. And the reason I've chosen to put the two together for you is this is also relying on classical allusions, on mythology, on history, the history of the Punic Wars in this case, using the wars of the past to understand the wars of the present. But stylistically, it's so different. Everything is fragmented, fractured, broken. one thing bumps up against another. And I think this demonstrates wonderfully what the war has done to the artistic consciousness, to the creative consciousness, to the way that poetry works, to the way we understand images, and also to the way that we understand that classical world, which was such a bulwark for Patrick Shaw Stewart. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many, I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street, to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours, with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. There, I saw one I knew, and stopped him, crying, "Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at Miley, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed?" And those could hardly be more different. And part of what excites me about that debate is, can we look at those differences? Can we saturate ourselves in those imaginations? Can we learn about the war from them?
Now, you may have encountered David Reynolds actually through his amazing radio series, America, Empire of Liberty. He's somebody with a historian with a truly international brief. And one of the fascinating things about this is how it looks at what the impact of the Great War, as we've come to know it, was all around the countries of the world, not just in Europe. You say there's a little skein of scepticism about poetry and the role that poets have played in your book. And I'm going to quote you against yourself again. This time it is you, not your blurb writer. Despite the efforts of revisionist historians, in Britain the Great War has remained a saga of personal tragedies illuminated by poetry, not history, a subject for remembrance rather than understanding.
Well, that certainly is a summary, really, of what I'm trying to do in the book, that we are now 100 years on from the opening of the Great War, and if you haven't noticed that already, you will certainly do so on the 4th of August and so on, and in fact, I think you will probably be so tired of the Great War by Christmas that you'll want a truce, but you've got 4 more years of it to go, so it's going to be a war of attrition, I think, the war of memory. But what I'm thinking is that we are now, in all the countries involved, there are no survivors who were engaged in combat. And if you think of the enormous, very moving ceremonies associated with the death of the last Tommy in this country, including a service of remembrance in Westminster Abbey, the same thing for Le Dernier Poilu in France, the last doughboy in the States, and so it goes on. Less in Germany. Germany is just beginning to come to wake up to the War of 1418. I was there last week for an event about their memorialization of it, and now it's beginning to be a subject of great interest. But in general, all our countries, we've moved on from any kind of communicative memory, in other words, memory shared by people who were there. And so what I say elsewhere in the book is we are now as far from the men who marched away to war in 1914 as they were from the soldiers who fought at Waterloo. It's 100 years on. And I think there is therefore a place for remembrance, but there's also a place now for understanding, historical understanding, thinking about the war as a historical phenomenon and opening up some of the aspects of the war that we are less familiar with. The home front, the experience of women and families on the home front in what was rightly called the First Total War. The global war, this is a war that affects China, Japan, India profoundly, and that's something that is not normally in our frame. The Middle East as well. So that's part of what I want to do in the book. But my particular issue about poetry is not so much is not to decry poetry, but simply to say that our understanding of the poetry of the Great War is a very narrow one. There's a sort of canon of a few poets that are cited again and again. And yet there are something like 2,200 people who publish poems about the Great War during the Great War. Now, some of those are one-offs, some of them are incredibly bad poems. Many of them written and published. I mean, the Times would publish poems every day to encourage people to enlist. It was a patriotic activity in the first couple of years of the war before we had conscription. You were trying to persuade people to enlist. Nevertheless, if you take those 2,200, 80% of them are civilians, and nearly a quarter, nearly 24% are women. Yet women poets of the Great War have only just begun to get onto our radar. I think the first collection of women poets was probably in our 1980s, something like that. So I have a particular view that, you know, a concern that there was a canon of key poets, supremely Wilfred Owen, but Sassoon, Brooke at the beginning, a kind of patriotic poet before, when it was still fashionable with patriotic. And I would like us to open up that canon and inspect, you know, more widely the writings of the war. And they are kind of just obsessed with the war. I didn't plan to read it, but I brought with me, for other reasons, Edmund Blunden's Undertones of War, which is a book written in the 1920s, and a very gentle attempt at reflecting on the war with some of his poems at the end. And there's, in the preface, it's something that I find very, very haunting. He's asking, this is written now in 1920, published in 1928, and he reflects on why he's doing this, why he should not write it, or why he might write it. And he says, I must go over the ground again. A voice, perhaps not my own, answers within me, you will be going over the ground again until that hour when agony's clawed face softens into the smilingness of a young spring day. And Blunden lived to 1974. He was a friend, a close friend of Sassoon's. It's interesting, Sassoon, though so angry about the war, writing some of the most biting satire, does move on in troubled ways. Blunden does keep going over that ground again. And in my book, I suggest that he is one of the people who is particularly responsible for our sense of who are the canonical poets of the war now. He's the one who rescues Owen from oblivion in the first substantial edition in the late 1920s. He's also the man who rescues Ivor Gurney from oblivion and so on. And he's the one who constructs a kind of story of who are the authentic poets of the war. And he says, they have to be soldier poets. They have to be men who fought. So it's a very, he's somebody who, as it were, keeps going over that ground again, and the way he does tread it has shaped the way we understand it still.
Fascinatingly, in Helen's wrote, I don't know whether any of you read it, a ghost story actually of the Second World War, The Great Coat, and has a wonderful afterword which says basically some events are so momentous that they keep coming back and back and back again. You are literally haunted by them in this case.
I do believe that they kind of open up this very deep fissure in time, and you can't just walk over it as if it were level ground. You have to either build some kind of bridge or you fall into it. And absolutely, I mean, to talk of other nations too, I mean, I was looking at Ungaretti and at Apollinaire, and interestingly, when Apollinaire was very seriously wounded during the First World War, but in fact he died in the Spanish flu epidemic, and he wrote, and it's his language, you see, what is different, he has this extremely highly rich language, and I've translated it, but it's about that men's experience, but it's also expressed in terrific colour. So it begins, nuit violente et violette et sombre et pleine d'or par moment, nuit des hommes seulement. And the translation of the poem, it's just a short one, is violet, violent night, shadowed, sometimes shot with gold, night of men only, night of 24th September. Tomorrow the attack, Violent night, oh night, whose terrible cry from the depths becomes, minute by minute, more intense. Night, which cries out like a woman in labour. Night of men only. And it seems to me what Apollinaire is describing there is something you can't just get over like that. You have to come to, and he's trying to come to terms with it at the time, because he wrote that in October 1915. So he's just noting it down, actually in a very highly wrought form when you read it in the French. And there's one line which is just, demain l'assaut, tomorrow the attack. And then there's this wonderful colour surrounding it. So that was how he solved that problem of how do you write about something so visceral and so violent and so immediate that was all around him. And I do think, I strongly agree with David, that you have to look more widely. You have to keep, it's very interesting to keep searching. And what I find is it's wonderful that there are anthologies of writing from across Europe in response to the Great War being produced now in translation. And that enables us to see to see different ways of looking at the same thing, and also to see enormous similarities.
Well, I think that's part of what I hope is going to come out of this 2014 commemoration, an attempt to just see this war, see our war, which in commemorative terms we're going to celebrate very nationally, but see it also in an international perspective, understand other countries and so on. And in going a couple of times to Germany, was there last week and next week, and what is fascinating is that the things we take absolutely for granted in this country are complete surprise to them in terms of, of the issues, the centrality of Belgium to the story of how we got into this war. Equally, there's a whole story about the German war which we don't understand. For the Germans in the 1920s, and to some extent still, this was billed as a defensive war because they were invaded by the Russians. The Russians invaded East Prussia. And they tend to ignore what they did, as it were, to invade Belgium. But there's a whole story there. And it is, of course, not accidental that the great German war memorial to the First World War was at Tannenberg in East Prussia. And it was, almost kind of mixture of Wagnerian set and Stonehenge. It's just absolutely incredible. You can't find it now. You can find a little bit of rubble because it's now in Poland, and it was blown up by Hitler on Hitler's orders when the Red Army advanced. So there's a whole story there about the complexities of the Great War and the way it's remembered, which is not particularly familiar to us.
One of the propositions in your book is that in Britain, England, because Ireland was in a slightly different position, it was less felt than elsewhere, but in the years before the Second World War.
Yes, I think it is fundamentally important that this country was less, the country itself was less touched by this war than continental Europe. Okay, there are some bombs dropped on London, but the death toll is, 1,600, something like this. There are some shells on the East Coast, Hartlepool, places like that. But this is a very different war from the Second World War. It's very different from the Blitz and the whole experience of being almost threatened with invasion. And so you have this disjunction. On the one hand, we lose, it's the worst war in our history, 720,000 men are killed. Yet, it's not clear that our national interest is involved in the same way as it was obviously for the French. 10 départements of northeastern France are occupied, the Germans, and brutally occupied. Belgium, again, occupied, and serious atrocities. The whole of Eastern Europe, what we now call Poland, is a battlefield and so on. So our war experience is very much that it's over there, yet somehow it's very close. If the wind's in the right direction, you can hear the guns.
But also there is an absence which matches the silence, and that's the absence of the dead, because of the decision made that the bodies would not be repatriated and they would stay. And then the later decisions made by the Imperial War Graves Commission and the way of memorialising and how that is done, and those uniform ranks of headstones, those inscriptions. I mean, that is a creation. That wasn't something that was inevitable at all. And one thing I'm very interested in my book is writing about what is it like to be in a country where there are so many dead, but they're all absent, and you can't see them. And the protagonist at one point, in a rage, says, if they'd come back, they would have filled up the fields. The farmers would have made sure the war ended earlier. Because there's something about not, you know, the landscape of England and Scotland and Wales remaining largely untouched. Ireland clearly is a different story. I think it was like a wound and a trauma that had an almost nightmarish quality to it, because people did not have a local grave. And although you did get the beginning of pilgrimages and trips, highly organised trips to France, you had that sense people had gone, and then they had fallen silent, and then there had been some words following a formula, and by that you learned that they were dead, and then you followed certain rites of mourning, but not the ones you were used to. So it's that absence that becomes extremely powerful, I think.
David, as a historian, what role do you think fiction has to play in this story?
Well, I think, as I was suggesting earlier, I think because some of these experiences we're talking about were incommunicable, in other words, didn't leave standard kinds of records that historians are used to, there is a space for novelists and artists to try and evoke imaginatively those experiences in ways that are, if you like, licensed extrapolations from what we've got. And I think there's a place for that. I mean, to put it another way, I think some historians have a sort of fetishism about documents, that, you know, what you do is simply reproduce a document. And I usually say to my students, okay, who has been the secretary of a committee or a, you know, JCR meeting in the college bar or something like this? You have had to write the minutes of that meeting. Do those minutes bear any resemblance to the kind of chaos and so on that was there? Answer, no. There was actually a wonderful verse in the Second World War. I don't know who wrote it. It was a civil servant who was connected with the cabinet office, and it goes like this. And so, while the great ones depart to their dinner, the secretary stays growing thinner and thinner, racking his brains to record and report what he thinks that they ought to have thought. So, you know, whenever, as historians, we read those kind of documents, we have to do a good deal of reading between the lines. So I don't, in principle, have a problem with the idea that novelists are doing even more reading between the lines. What we're trying to do, I mean, what we're trying to get at is not the paper, the materials left from the past are not the reality. What we're trying to do is construct a sense of what life might have been like. And I think there's a place for novelists and for historians in doing that.
And scrupulousness is really important, isn't it? We've talked before about the research that went into this novel and the fact that it undercut some of the cliches, that it was all about trenches and mud. It was also about sort of huge industrial scale troop movements and...
Yes, absolutely.
Changing social fabric.
Yes, it was. And maybe what novelists are interested is perhaps not so much what life was like, but what a life was like. So you're going deep into the interior and imagining and listening, and unless the character has enough force and enough reality and enough voice to stand on his own feet, you're not going to, or her own feet, you're not going to write about them anyway. So I would say that the research task of a novelist is somewhat different from the research task of a historian, which is you do your research partly in order to seem not to know it, to seem to be familiar, to seem as if that is just part of you, that is something you know, without, you can put out your hand and touch it. You know what it feels like to be inside those clothes. You know what it feels like to rub whale oil into your feet, you understand the kind of physical heft and weight of it, but also because we all know about the loneliness of being a human being confronted with experience that we can't quite deal with. And I suppose as readers and as writers, we all empathise and we all are willing probably to go on that journey, no matter how difficult it is. So that, I think, is what a novelist is trying to do, and to be as scrupulous as you can be, and to accept that sometimes you have to know that you don't know, but not to put in gratuitously things that you don't know, things that nobody knows, things that nobody knows.